Ethan Mercer was folding the last of her clothes when he found the phone. Not her current phone, the old one. The one she said she had thrown away 2 years ago, the month before she agreed to marry him. He did not drop it. He did not call her name from the bedroom doorway. He did not do any of the things a man is supposed to do when his chest falls open and everything he thought was real slides quietly through the floor. He set the phone on the corner of the dresser next to the photograph of them at the harbor, and he finished folding her clothes. Then he sat on the edge of the bed that still smelled like her shampoo, something with almonds in it. Something he would never be able to smell again without his stomach turning. And he looked at that phone for a long time. He did not turn it on. Not yet. Because Ethan Mercer had spent his entire adult life learning to be careful with truth. He had learned, the hard way, that truth does not arrive cleanly. It does not arrive with a note that explains itself. It arrives in pieces. And it asks you to do the assembling. And the assembling is where people break. He was 31 years old. He was 7 months married. He had a job he was good at, an apartment on the 14th floor of a building with large windows that faced west, and a wife named Claire who said she loved him in the way that people say things they have repeated so many times the words have worn smooth. Like stones in a river, still real, still present, but so familiar they have lost their edges. He had believed her. That was the part that would take the longest to answer for. But here, at the beginning, before he turned on that phone, before he understood what he was holding, he needs you to understand something about who he was. Because the man Ethan Mercer became over the next 9 weeks did not come from nowhere. He came from a specific place, a specific silence, a specific night 6 years earlier, when he saw something he was never supposed to see, and he chose to say nothing. That silence had shaped everything after it, and now everything after it was about to reshape him. He had met Claire Nguyen on a Tuesday in October, in the waiting room of a dental office in Midtown, where neither of them wanted to be. She was reading a magazine she clearly wasn't reading. She had one leg folded under her on the chair, which was exactly the kind of small, comfortable rebellion that waiting rooms are not supposed to permit. And she was holding the magazine at an angle that made it obvious she was watching the fish tank in the corner instead of the pages. He noticed that. He noticed things. He had always noticed things, and said very little about them. It was one of the things Claire would later call one of his best qualities, and then, later still, one of his most exhausting ones. They did not speak in the waiting room. They did not speak when his name was called and he stood up. But when he came back 40 minutes later, numb on the left side and carrying the mild humiliation of a man who has just had a cavity filled in the center of his afternoon, she was still there. And she looked up from the magazine she still wasn't reading, and she said without preamble, "Was it bad?" He said, "Not as bad as waiting." She laughed. And that was the whole beginning. A bad tooth, a fish tank, a woman who preferred the truth over politeness. He had found that combination irresistible. They dated for a year and a half. They moved in together on a rainy Saturday in April. Boxes carried up 2 flights of elevator because the freight elevator was broken. And she had labeled every single box in precise black marker. Kitchen, bathroom, books fiction, books nonfiction, things that have no category. And that precision had made him feel, in a way he could not entirely explain, that he was safe. He proposed on a regular Wednesday. No restaurant, no ring hidden in a dessert. They were at home, eating takeout noodles from containers, and the light was doing something particular through the west window, something long and golden. And he looked at her and said, "I think we should get married." And she said, without pausing her eating, "I think you're right." And that was that. He had told his mother. His mother had said, "She makes you calm." And she had been right. Claire made him calm in the specific way that certain people make certain rooms feel smaller than they are. Not claustrophobic, just bounded. Safe. He had carried that feeling all the way to 7 months into the marriage. And then the old phone. The one she said she had thrown away. The night before he found it, Claire had taken a work trip to Portland. She worked in urban planning, a job that required her to be in cities that weren't this one sometimes, to look at buildings and roads and drainage systems and imagine them differently. He had always liked that about her work. She looked at broken things and thought about how to make them function. She had left a suitcase on the bedroom floor, half-packed, for 2 days before she left. This was not like her. Claire was a person who prepared. She made lists. She color-coded calendars. The half-packed suitcase had nagged at him in the way small wrongnesses nag, quietly, from the corner of the room. After she left, he had finished packing it out of habit, the way you tidy something that doesn't belong to you, because leaving it undone feels wrong. Rolled the last 2 shirts. Added the charger she always forgot. Folded the small gray cardigan she took on every trip because she was always cold. That was when his hand found the old phone. It was at the bottom of the inside pocket of the suitcase, the one with the broken zipper that didn't close all the way. He would not have reached in if he hadn't been looking for loose change, because she always left loose change in suitcase pockets and hated finding it at airports. It was a slim phone, black. He knew it immediately because he had given it to her. It was the phone she had used the first 2 years they were together, before it started freezing and she upgraded. She had told him she recycled it. He remembered the specific sentence. "I dropped it off at that electronics place on 41st. They take old phones." He had believed her. He picked it up now and turned it over in his hands. It was powered off. The screen was clean, not dusty, not stored, not discarded. Kept. He set it on the dresser. Then he sat down and thought for a long time about what kind of person keeps a phone they said they threw away. He thought about this for so long that the light through the west window moved all the way across the floor and disappeared. And then he went to sleep. He did not sleep well. In the morning, he stood in the kitchen with coffee he wasn't tasting, and he made a list in his head. He was good at lists. He had grown up with a mother who managed anxiety by organizing it, and he had inherited this without fully realizing it. The list was: 1. Claire was not a person who lost things or forgot to throw things away. She was the opposite of that kind of person. 2. The phone had been at the bottom of the most hidden pocket in her suitcase, not the outer pocket where you put things casually, the inside one. 3. It had been clean. He stopped the list there because the 4th item was the one he wasn't ready to write. He went to work. He was a structural engineer, and his current project was the renovation of a transit hub downtown, a building from the 1940s that the city wanted to preserve the outside of, while rebuilding everything inside. He liked this kind of work. He liked the puzzle of it. How do you hold up something old while making room for something new? How do you preserve the face of a thing while completely rebuilding its bones? He did not think about this irony until later. He came home at 6. The apartment was quiet in the way that apartments are quiet when they're waiting for something. He set his bag down. He opened the refrigerator and looked at it for a moment without seeing anything in it. Then he closed it. He stood in the kitchen for a while. He poured a glass of water and drank half of it, and set it on the counter. He looked at the picture on the refrigerator, one of those ordinary couple pictures taken at his brother's cookout last summer, both of them squinting into the late afternoon light. Claire's hair doing something in the wind that she had complained about in the photo, but that he had found completely right about her in that moment. He had put it up. She had never moved it. He thought about all the things you can observe about a person for months and still be wrong about what you're seeing. Then he went to the dresser. He picked up the phone. The fourth item on his list was, there are things on this phone that Claire did not want him to find. He pressed the power button. The screen lit up. It asked for a passcode. He typed in her birthday. Wrong. He tried the year they got together. Wrong. He tried her apartment number from before they lived together. Wrong. He set the phone down. He thought. Then he picked it up again and typed in the date of their first real conversation. The Tuesday in October. The dental waiting room. Her passcode for everything when they first met had been dates. She had a memory for them. He had teased her about it once, and she had said, "Dates are just coordinates. They tell you where something happened in time." The phone opened. He told himself he would look for just a moment, just enough to understand why she had kept it. The first thing he saw was the text thread at the top of the screen. The contact name was a single letter, M. The last message was dated April 14th, 14 months ago. He opened it. The messages went back 2 years, to the month before she said yes when he asked her to marry him. He sat down on the floor. He did not read everything that night. He read enough. He read until the words stopped being sentences and started being a sound, a low, continuous sound, like the hum of a building settling around a structural fault it has carried for years without anyone noticing. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and went to the window and looked out at the city for a long time. The city was doing what it always did. The lights were on, the traffic moved. The rain was starting, soft and colorless against the glass. He had a specific feeling he could not name, a feeling that had no single word for it in English. The feeling of a man who has found the proof of something he did not fully believe until now, but who realizes, reading it, that some part of him always knew. He had stayed silent once before about something he saw. He had sworn to himself he would never do it again. But there are different kinds of silence, and he was only beginning to understand the difference between the kind that protects and the kind that simply delays the damage. You need to know about the other silence first, the one from 6 years before Claire. Ethan had been 25. He was working his first real job at a mid-size engineering firm called Aldworth & Crane. He had a colleague, a man named Daniel Foss, 7 years older. The kind of person who filled rooms and made junior employees feel simultaneously seen and slightly unimportant. Daniel was good at his job. He was also married, with a young daughter, and his wife Rebecca was the kind of woman who made you feel, in 5 minutes of conversation, that the room was more honest for her being in it. Ethan had liked them both. Had been to their apartment twice for dinner. Had watched Daniel cut his daughter's food into careful pieces and thought, this is what a family looks like. And then, one Thursday night, leaving the office late, he had seen something on the floor below theirs, through the glass wall of a conference room, the kind of thing you see when you take the wrong stairwell. Daniel, with a woman from the marketing department. Her name was Layla. They were not discussing a project. Ethan had kept walking. He had told himself it was not his business. He had told himself Rebecca probably knew or didn't know, and either way it was not his marriage and not his information to carry. He had told himself 100 things, and each one of them was true in some small technical sense and false in every other sense. 3 months later, Daniel asked for Ethan's opinion on a structural report. Ethan gave it, honestly. Daniel used it to take credit for the project. Ethan said nothing. He had already learned how not to say things. It was getting easier. 8 months after that, Rebecca and Daniel separated. A colleague told him, in the kitchen, in passing, "Did you hear? Foss and his wife are splitting up." And Ethan had said, "Oh," and poured his coffee and gone back to his desk, and sat there for the rest of the afternoon, understanding, in a deep and specific way, what silence costs when it is bought at someone else's expense. He had left that firm 4 months later, not because of guilt, exactly. More because the building had started to feel like a place where something was waiting behind every wall, and he could not stop listening for it. He had spent 6 years building a different version of himself, a version that paid attention, that asked questions, that did not look away from things just because looking was uncomfortable. He had married Claire because she was the first person in a long time who made him feel like he did not have to work to be honest. And now he was sitting on a floor in the dark with her hidden phone in his jacket pocket, reading messages between his wife and a man named M, and understanding that he had been watching without seeing again for months. His name was Marcus Tan. Ethan found this out not from the phone, but from a different kind of searching, the careful, methodical kind that his job had taught him. You do not look for the thing you are afraid to find. You look for the shape of the empty space where the thing should be. Marcus Tan was 34. He was a landscape architect. He had a firm with a small portfolio of impressive projects. Parks and public spaces that showed up in design magazines Ethan had occasionally seen on Claire's nightstand. He had, at some point in his life, lived in this city. He also appeared as a name in a joint project file in a proposal that Claire's firm had submitted 18 months ago. A transit-adjacent park project, urban planning and landscape architecture. The two disciplines overlap more than most people think. Ethan had found the connection by doing what structural engineers do, looking at load paths. Where does the weight of this situation rest? Trace it back to the origin point. He had not confronted Claire. She came home from Portland, and he met her at the door and helped her with her bag and said, "How was it?" And she said, "Long." The city wants to add a whole new interchange that doesn't need to be there. And he said, "That's cities." And she laughed and went to change her shoes, and he stood in the hallway and breathed. He was becoming very good at breathing. That night she asked him if something was wrong, and he said he was tired from a long week at work, and she accepted this without pressing. She accepted it in the way that people accept things they are half prepared to believe. He noticed that. He was beginning to notice everything differently. The messages on the phone went back 2 years, but they were not what he had first assumed. He had assumed the worst, and the worst was there, yes, embedded in the thread like rebar in concrete, present, structural, load-bearing. But the messages were also something more complicated than the worst. He had gone back to read them fully on the second night, after Claire was asleep. He sat in the kitchen with the phone and his coffee and the rain that was still going outside. The thread began in February, 2 years ago. Casual, professional communication at first. Claire and Marcus Tan had worked together on the park proposal. They had meetings. They had deadlines. The messages were what messages between colleagues look like when they are still only that. And then, in March, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a single line that announced itself as the crossing. The way these things always go, the crossing was barely visible when it happened, just a degree of warmth that didn't belong to a professional context, just a joke that lasted a sentence too long, just a message sent at 11:30 at night about nothing in particular. By April, Ethan could see clearly what was happening. In May, Claire had ended it. He read that part 3 times because it stopped him. She had ended it in a message that was 2 paragraphs long and said, without equivocation, that she was going to marry Ethan, and that she loved him, and that what had happened with Marcus was something she was ashamed of, and that she needed Marcus not to contact her again. Marcus had responded with a single sentence. "I'll respect that. But I want you to know that I'm not going to pretend it wasn't real." Claire had not replied. And then, 14 months ago, one last message from Marcus. "I heard you got married. I hope you're happy. I mean that." No reply from Claire. Ethan sat in the kitchen for a long time with this information. He had expected the worst. He had found something different. Not better. Not forgivable in any easy way, but different. The timeline meant that when Claire agreed to marry him, she had already ended it. The marriage itself was not, as he had feared, a cover story. But it also meant she had hidden this for 2 years. And the phone. She had kept the phone, not to continue the affair, but perhaps to keep the evidence of the ending, to keep the record of the choice she had made. He sat with this for a very long time. Then he made a second list. What did he know? Claire had been unfaithful before the engagement. She had ended it on her own. She had kept the evidence hidden, but had not resumed contact. What did he not know? Why she had kept the phone. Whether Marcus Tan had kept his word. Whether there were things the phone could not tell him. Whether Claire had ever come close to telling him the truth. And then, the question underneath all the other questions. Whether a person who ends an affair and stays silent about it is the same kind of person as a person who ends an affair and tells. He already knew the answer, technically. He had lived 6 years in the residue of his own silence, and he knew exactly what it cost. But knowing the answer technically and knowing it in your body are two separate things. He closed the phone. He went back to bed. He lay beside his wife in the dark and listened to the sound of her breathing. And he thought about all the things a person can learn about another person in 7 months of marriage, and all the things a person can fail to learn in 7 months of marriage, and how those two categories are not always as different as you want them to be. The next morning, he made a decision. He was going to find out who Marcus Tan was now. Not to confront him. Not yet. Not for any reason he could have fully explained, only because the structural part of his thinking, the part that said you cannot understand the load until you've mapped all the points where it bears, told him that he was missing something. The phone was not the whole story. There was a shape to this that he hadn't found yet. He started with what he could access professionally. Marcus Tan's firm had a public portfolio, LinkedIn, industry publications. He had attended 2 conferences in the last year that Ethan found mentioned in the program PDFS. He was, by the appearance of things, exactly what the project files suggested. A competent, moderately successful landscape architect with a specialization in urban green space. He had also been photographed at an industry event 7 months ago. 8 weeks after Ethan and Claire's wedding, in the photograph, Marcus Tan was standing next to a woman with short hair and a lanyard that identified her as a speaker. They were both smiling. There was nothing in the photograph that should have told Ethan anything he needed to know. But then he looked at the background of the photograph, and he recognized the conference center. It was the same one where Claire had presented a paper 3 weeks before the wedding. He stared at that for a moment. Then he pulled out his calendar and looked at the dates. The conference where Claire had presented her paper was on March 14th and 15th. She had attended both days. She had come home on the 15th, saying the second day had been mostly administrative. Marcus Tan's event photograph was time-stamped, March 15th. Ethan closed his laptop. He went to the window. Same conference center, same date. Both of them there, in the same building, 3 weeks before the wedding. After 14 months of no contact. He stood at the window and counted the stories of the building across the street and thought about what this meant, if it meant anything. He could not know for certain what had happened at that conference. He could not know if they had seen each other, spoken, found each other in a corridor, sat near each other at a session, avoided each other across a room. He could not know anything. But he had learned something from his years of structural work. The absence of evidence at a load point is not the same as evidence of absence. Sometimes the most important information is what a structure does not tell you, what it hides inside its walls. what it carries without showing strain until the day it cannot carry it anymore. He needed to talk to someone. Not Claire, not yet. He called his older brother Patrick, who lived in Chicago and who had the particular quality of being able to listen without advising. He took the train home after work, sat in the kitchen with the window open because the rain had finally stopped, and he said, "I found something. I don't know how to think about it." Patrick said, "Tell me." He told him, not everything, the phone, the messages, the conference date. He framed it as facts, the way he always did when the emotion was too close to look at directly. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then Patrick said, "Before you do anything, ask yourself what you're actually trying to find out. Because those are two different jobs. Finding out the truth and deciding what to do with the truth. You're only on the first job right now." Ethan said, "I know." Patrick said, "Do you want my honest thought?" Ethan said, "That's why I called." Patrick said, "She ended it. She chose you, but she kept the phone and she never told you." That's 3 facts. The first fact is the one people want to excuse. The third one is the one you actually have to live with. Ethan had no answer for that. He thanked his brother and hung up, and sat in the quiet of his kitchen. And he thought about what it means to keep a phone, what it means to press delete on a history but keep the device, what it means to carry a record of the worst thing you've done and the best choice you made, locked together in a pocket, hidden at the bottom of a suitcase. He thought about this for 3 days. And then the situation changed. On the 4th day after the phone call with Patrick, he got an email. It was from a name he didn't recognize. The subject line was, "I need to talk to you about Claire." He stared at it for a moment. He almost didn't open it. He opened it. The email was short. It said, "My name is Sujin Park. I used to work with Marcus Tan at a firm before he started his own. I'm reaching out because I think you deserve to know something that has nothing to do with what you might be thinking, and everything to do with why your wife kept that phone. Please call me if you're willing. I can explain more." At the bottom was a phone number. He sat back. He read it again. Someone knew he had found the phone. Or at minimum, someone had expected that he would eventually find it. How? He thought about the conference date. He thought about the message 14 months ago. "I heard you got married. I hope you're happy." And then nothing. He thought, something is missing from this picture. And this woman is the frame. He called the number. Her name was Sujin Park. She had worked at a landscape architecture firm for 3 years in her late 20s, overlapping with Marcus Tan for the first year and a half. She had left the industry entirely after that. She worked in nonprofit management now. She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to do this for over a year." Her voice was careful. The voice of someone who is rehearsed and still isn't sure they're saying it right. Ethan said, "Then say it." She said, "Marcus Tan is not the person you're thinking he is." Ethan said, "I don't know who I'm thinking he is." There was a pause. Then she said, "He pursued Claire, deliberately, over a long period. She wasn't the first." Ethan was quiet. She went on. She told him, carefully, with the specific restraint of someone who had thought hard about what to include and what to leave out, that Marcus Tan had a pattern, that in the years she had worked near him, she had watched him build careful relationships with women in adjacent professional fields, that there was a specific methodology to it: initial professional contact, gradual escalation, strategic emotional investment, then retreat at the moment of maximum attachment. She did not say predatory, but the structure of what she described required no other word. She said, "I don't know everything that happened between him and your wife. I only know what I watched happen with 2 other women before her. And I know that when I heard he had been in contact with someone at a planning firm, and I heard later what had happened, I felt sick about staying quiet. Ethan said, very quietly, "How did you not contact me?" Soo-jin said, "I'm friends with someone who works in Claire's firm. She mentioned casually weeks ago, she had no idea what she was telling me, that Claire had seemed distracted lately. And I know the signs of someone sitting on a secret." Another pause. She said, "I'm not telling you this to excuse your wife. I'm telling you this because you deserve the full picture. She made choices, but so did he, for longer and more deliberately than she may have understood." Ethan sat at his desk with his hand pressed flat against the surface. He said, "Why didn't Claire know about the pattern?" Soo-jin said, "Because people who do this are very careful. And because women who've been targeted by someone like this often think they were the exception, the one he was actually in love with. That's the design." He thanked her. He asked her to send him anything she had documented. She said, "I want you to know, I almost didn't call. I went back and forth for months, and then I thought, the thing I've regretted most in my life is the time I watched something happen and said nothing. I didn't want to do that again." He heard those words land. He said, "I know exactly what you mean." The files she sent him the next morning were a year's worth of careful keeping. Soo-jin Park was not the kind of person who acted impulsively. She had documented things the way Ethan documented things, systematically, because she understood that a feeling without evidence is just a feeling, and a feeling with evidence is a record. She sent him screenshots from women who had agreed to share their experiences with her, women who had each had some version of what Claire had had, who had each reached a point of ending it and never knowing that they were one in a sequence. She sent him a timeline. She sent him copies of public professional profiles that showed the overlaps. She had also sent him something he had not expected, a copy of a message exchange between Marcus Tan and another woman, not Claire, but one of the earlier ones, in which Marcus had discussed, with a directness that was almost clinical, his interest in Claire as a professional contact. The message was dated 4 months before he and Claire had begun their first meeting on the park project. He had not met Claire by accident. He had found her specifically. He had attended an industry mixer where he knew Claire's firm would be present. He had identified her professionally and then created the context for them to work together. 4 months before he said hello to her for the first time, he had written someone else's name and said, "I've been thinking about approaching her for the transit park proposal." Ethan read that sentence 3 times. Then he thought about something Claire had mentioned once, in passing, early in their relationship, how she had been recommended for the transit park project by a partner at her firm who had received a call from Marcus Tan's firm, specifically requesting her input. He had thought nothing of it at the time. He thought a great deal of it now. He had a choice. This is where some people make the mistake of thinking the choice is simple: confront or don't confront, leave or stay, forgive or not. But those are only the visible surfaces of the choice. Underneath them, something more fundamental was happening. Ethan was deciding what kind of man he was going to be, and what he was going to do with information that could not be unfound. He had spent 6 years watching himself stay silent about Daniel Foss, and knowing, each year, that it had cost him something. Not just his conscience, something structural. Some core, load-bearing element of his sense of himself as a person who acts when action is required. He was not going to be silent again. But silence and speaking are not the only options. There is a third thing: preparing. Understanding the full picture before you open your mouth. Making sure that when the truth detonates, it detonates correctly, not as anger, not as accusation, but as clarity. He spent the next week doing what he did best. He mapped the structure. He built a timeline from the files Soo Jin had sent, from the messages on the phone, from the conference records, from the professional overlaps. He assembled it in a document that was 12 pages long by the time he was done. Not to use as a weapon, to understand the shape of the thing. And what he found at the end of 12 pages was this. Claire had been targeted. She had been pursued through a calculated professional introduction. She had responded. That part was hers. She had made choices. But she had responded to someone who had been designing her response for months before it began. And when she finally, at some cost that he could not fully see, chose to end it, she had done so without anyone in her life ever knowing what had happened. She had carried it alone. And kept the phone. He thought about why a person keeps a phone like that. Not to sustain contact, not for nostalgia, but perhaps because it is the only record of a thing that actually happened, that you cannot pretend did not happen, even if you wish it had not. Perhaps because throwing it away would feel like lying to yourself, and she had decided, in her own way, that the self was the one witness she could not deceive. He thought about Soo Jin, who had spent a year deciding whether to speak. He thought about himself, 25, in a stairwell, watching through a glass wall. He thought about Rebecca Foss, whose marriage had ended, who would never know that a young engineer had walked past a glass wall and kept going. He thought, the silence of people who know things does more damage than most people account for. He called Claire. She was at work. He did not say why he was calling. He said, "Come home early if you can. I want to cook dinner." There was a pause on the line. She said, "Is everything okay?" He said, "I want to talk to you. It's important." Another pause. Longer. She said, "Okay." He heard something in her voice that he had heard many times before and never correctly identified. He had always named it caution. He understood now that it was readiness. She had been ready for a long time. He cooked pasta, something simple, because the simplicity was intentional. He set the table properly, the way she liked it, with the cloth napkins she insisted on even on weeknights. He opened wine. He put the hidden phone in his jacket pocket. She came home at 6:15 and stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, reading the room the way she read rooms, the way she had always read rooms, in a way he had admired. She said, "Ethan." Just his name. He said, "Sit down, please." She sat. He poured the wine. He sat across from her. He did not begin immediately because he had learned something from his week of mapping. The truth is more powerful when you don't sprint toward it, when you let it take up the space it deserves. He had also learned from years of structural work that the most important moment before you expose a failing is the moment of silence just before it. The inspection pause. When the engineer stops moving and simply looks, and the building doesn't know yet that it's been found. She looked at him across the table. She had her hands in her lap. She was wearing a pale blue sweater he recognized, one she had bought the winter before they got married, one that had a small pull at the left cuff she had never fixed because she never got around to it. He had always meant to ask her about it. He had never asked. The pasta was getting warm on the stove. The wine was the right temperature. Outside the window, the city was transitioning from the metallic sound of rush hour into something quieter, something that moved more slowly. He said, "I want to tell you something first." She waited. He said, "When I was 25, I worked at a firm called Aldworth and Crane. There was a man there named Daniel Foss. He was respected, senior, and he was cheating on his wife. I saw it. Not a rumor, I saw it with my eyes, clearly, in a way that left no room for doubt. Claire was very still. He said, "And I said nothing. I walked past and said nothing." And 8 months later, his wife and he separated, and I sat at my desk knowing that my silence was part of the cost of that. I've carried that for 6 years. He let that sit for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and set the old phone on the table between them. Claire looked at it for a long time. Her face did not collapse. It did not perform shock. It did something else. It steadied, the way a person steadies themselves when something they have been braced for has finally arrived. She said, "How long have you known?" He said, "About 3 weeks." She said, "And you've been living with it?" He said, "I've been understanding it. There's a difference." She looked at him. Her eyes were careful and very still, the way they got when she was thinking something she hadn't yet decided to say. She said, "I need to tell you everything." He said, "I know some of it already." She said, "Tell me what you know." He told her. He told her about the messages, about Sujin Park, about the conference date, about the professional contact request that had created the conditions for her and Marcus to meet. He told her the structure of it, the timeline, the pattern. With each piece, something happened to her face. Not surprise. Something more specific, the particular expression of a person who has carried a thing alone and is watching someone else lift part of the weight. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know about the others." He said, "I know." She said, I genuinely believed I was an exception, that it was something real that I chose to end for the right reasons." He said, "You did choose to end it. That part was real." She said, "But the beginning wasn't." He said, "No." She put her hands flat on the table, the way she did when she was thinking. Her wine was untouched. The pasta was getting cold. She said, "I kept the phone because I needed proof that I made the right choice. Not proof for you, proof for me. Every time I almost talked myself into believing it hadn't happened, or that it had been smaller than it was, I could look at that phone and remember exactly what I chose and why." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know you are." She said, "What do you want to do?" It was a direct question, asked in the specific voice she used when she meant business, when she was cutting through the part of a conversation that is maneuvering and getting to the part that is actual. He looked at her for a long time. He said, "I want to tell you what I've spent 3 weeks understanding, and I want to know whether you can be honest with me from now on about the things you've been carrying alone." She said, "Yes." He said, "Because I can't do this again. Not because of what you did before the wedding, but because silence is the thing that broke the other marriage I watched, and I'm not going to live inside another one." She said, "I know. I know that about you. I've known it for a while." He said, "Did you keep the phone because you thought I'd need to find it someday?" She looked at him. Something crossed her face that he had not expected. She said, "I kept it because I thought maybe someday I'd have the courage to show it to you myself." The room was quiet for a long time. The city was doing its night things outside the window, the distant machinery of it, the lights, the rain that had started again. He said, "Then let's start there." But it wasn't over. He knew it wasn't over, because there was still Marcus Tan. Not for revenge in the simple sense. Ethan was not a person who thought in simple senses. He was a person who thought in structures, and the structure here was, a man had deliberately engineered the emotional lives of multiple women, had done so professionally, had used the architecture of professional trust to create conditions for personal exploitation, and had left behind him a trail of women who had each been convinced they were unique. He was not a criminal in any legal sense that Ethan could easily identify, but he was precisely the kind of damage that persists because no single person sees enough of the whole picture to act. Soojin Park had seen enough. He called her. He said, "The women who shared their stories with you, would they be willing to talk to each other?" Soojin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been trying to build that for a year. I've been waiting for someone else to see the whole shape of it." He said, "I see it." She said, "What are you thinking?" He said, "Marcus Tan works in a field with professional ethics standards. His firm pursues public contracts, parks, civic spaces, publicly funded projects. There are boards, there are professional associations, there are processes for reporting conduct that affects professional relationships and creates conflicts of interest." Soojin said, "He's careful. He never made it official with any of them." "There's no HR record." Ethan said, "No, but there's documentation. There are patterns. There are multiple witnesses to a methodology that amounts to professional misconduct. And in my experience, a structure that's been load-bearing invisible damage for years doesn't require a single catastrophic event to expose. It just requires someone to show where the cracks are." Soojin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been building the case." He said, "I've been understanding the structure. Now I'm going to share it." He spent the next 3 weeks working with Soojin on something he thought of, privately, as a load path analysis. Not a takedown, not a public exposure designed for maximum damage. A careful, documented presentation, submitted to the professional association that governed landscape architecture licensing in the state, along with the accounts of 3 women, each one reviewed and voluntarily contributed, each one specific and documented, about the pattern of behavior that Marcus Tan had used to damage professional relationships and exploit professional trust. The document Ethan built was 41 pages long. He had worked on engineering reports longer than that, but none had felt as heavy per page as this one. He and Soojin had divided the sections carefully. She handled the narrative accounts from the women involved, drawing them out over several conversations and checking every detail against the documentation. He handled the professional overlap analysis, the conference appearances, the contract timing, the professional contact request that had introduced Claire to Marcus's firm, the part that established a pattern of deliberate professional maneuvering for personal purposes. He had spent 2 evenings on a single paragraph that described how Marcus Tan had used the architecture of professional introduction, a trusted referral from a senior partner, to establish contact with Claire in a context that removed any suspicion of personal agenda. He had rewritten the paragraph 6 times, not because he was searching for emotional language, but because he wanted the language to be exactly accurate, engineering precise, describing the mechanism without editorializing. Soojin had read the final version and said, "You write like you're building something." He had said, "That's what this is." It was not dramatic. It did not happen fast. The association opened a review. The way these institutions open reviews, slowly, methodically, giving all parties time to respond. Ethan did not monitor it obsessively. He had done what he could do, and now it was out of his hands, which was exactly where he wanted it. He told Claire what he had done. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you." He said, "I wasn't doing it for you." She said, "I know. That's why I'm thanking you." He understood what she meant. She was thanking him for doing the thing that needed doing without making it about her, without using it as a ledger entry in their own accounting, without making her feel like the object of a rescue. He had done it because a 25-year-old version of himself had walked past a glass wall and kept going. and he was finished with that. 3 months after the complaint was submitted, the professional association issued its findings. Marcus Tan was not disbarred. That was not the mechanism available. But the finding was specific, and it was public, and it landed in his professional record with the permanence of rebar set in concrete. Conduct detrimental to professional relationships. Sustained pattern of behavior in professional engagement contexts. The wording was precise and bloodless, and damaging in exactly the way that bloodless precision is damaging when it is accurate. 3 of his 4 public contract bids in the months following were declined. His firm did not close, but it shrank, and it continued to shrink. And the design magazine that had once run a small feature on one of his parks did not call for a second one. Ethan learned this from Soo Jin, who followed it with the careful attention of someone who had waited a long time to see a structure show its cracks. She sent him a short message. "It's not everything, but it's documented. Thank you for building it with me." He replied, "Thank you for being the witness who came forward." She replied, "I should have done it sooner." He replied, "You did it when you could. That's how it usually goes." He thought about that exchange for a long time afterward. He and Claire did not immediately become fine. People who want clean endings misunderstand the physics of damage. A structure that has been carrying an invisible crack for years does not simply heal when the crack is exposed. It requires work. Careful, methodical, unglamorous work. The kind of work that happens in the morning over coffee, and in the arguments that don't resolve in one night, and in the small negotiations over what honesty actually looks like between 2 people who are trying to rebuild the same thing from the inside. There was a specific kind of pain in the weeks after the dinner that he had not expected. He had expected anger. He had felt anger in flashes, mostly in the late evenings when the weight of the 2 years before the wedding settled on him. But the sharper, more lasting pain was something else. It was the pain of recalibration, going back through 2 years of conversations and a 7-month marriage, and understanding which moments had been fully true, and which had been true in the way that a weight-bearing wall is true, structurally sound on the surface, carrying something hidden. He would remember, for instance, the specific Saturday 3 weeks before the wedding, when Claire had gone quiet for half an afternoon, and he had asked her what was wrong, and she had said, "Just tired." And he had believed her. He would now look at the calendar on his phone and see that the Saturday in question was 4 days after the conference where Marcus Tan had been photographed at the same center. He did not know what had happened at that conference. He still didn't know, and he decided, eventually, that he was not going to ask. Not because he was afraid of the answer, because the specific shape of that day was not the load-bearing element. The load-bearing element was what she had chosen to carry afterward, and what she had eventually set down. They went to therapy. He would have preferred to say it helped immediately, but the truth was that it helped slowly, which is the only way things that need to be rebuilt actually get rebuilt. Their therapist, a woman named Dr. Hera, who wore reading glasses she was always misplacing, and who had the specific gift of sitting with silence until the silence said something useful, told them in the 3rd session that the most common mistake in rebuilding trust was treating it as a destination rather than a practice. She said, "Trust is not a state you achieve. It's a behavior you repeat, both of you." Claire had looked at Ethan when Dr. Hara said that. He had looked back. There was a particular texture to that moment. Not resolution, not forgiveness, not even hope exactly. More like recognition. 2 people sitting in the same room with a clear view of the same problem, finally looking at it together, instead of looking at each other across it. There were nights when he lay awake next to her and felt the weight of what was not said over the first year of their marriage. And the weight was real, and he did not pretend it wasn't. There were mornings when she looked at him with a frankness that had not been entirely there before, a directness that came from having been fully seen by someone and having survived it. And he thought, this is what was always possible. We just had to get here through the harder way. One evening, several months in, she asked him something he had not expected. She said, "Do you think you could have loved Daniel Foss's wife more than you loved the comfort of staying quiet?" He thought about this for a long time. He said, "I think I was 25, and I didn't understand what silence costs. I thought it was the neutral choice. I thought it was staying out of something that wasn't mine." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I think silence is never neutral. It always weighs something. You just don't always know what until later." She said, "I'm sorry I made you carry mine." He said, "I'm sorry I didn't make it easier to put down." They sat with that for a while. The city was outside the window, as it always was. The lights were on. Something was always being built or rebuilt somewhere below. He could hear, if he paid attention, the low, constant sound of a city that never fully stops working. He thought, this is the thing about structures. The work is never really finished. You maintain them. You inspect them. You look for the places where weight is accumulating that shouldn't be, and you redistribute it before it becomes damage. It is not dramatic work. It does not make a good story when you describe it, but it is the only kind of work that actually holds. The old phone sat in a drawer in his desk for several more weeks before he did anything with it. He had thought about destroying it. He had thought about keeping it. He had thought about giving it back to Claire, which was the kind of symbolic gesture that makes sense in theory, but is strange in practice. What he did in the end was simpler. He opened the messages one last time. He read the last few exchanges. Marcus's message, 14 months after silence. "I heard you got married. I hope you're happy." And the absence of reply. And then Claire's message from 2 years ago, before the engagement, the one where she had ended it. He read it again, fully. It was not a perfect message. It was the message of someone who was afraid and ashamed and trying to be honest at the same time, which is its own specific kind of courage. He closed the thread. He turned the phone off. He put it back in the drawer, but not at the bottom. He put it where things go when they're still being processed, at the front, visible, not hidden. He thought, there are things that shouldn't be destroyed, not because they're good, but because they're true. And there is a difference between keeping a truth and being kept by it. He understood now the difference. He made coffee. He stood at the window. The light was doing something particular. Long and morning horizontal, the way it got in fall when the angle changed and the city suddenly looked like a different place, something older and more deliberate than it usually appeared. He thought about Sujin Park, who had spent a year waiting to become someone who acted. He thought about the 3 women who had sent their accounts into a formal record at no small personal cost. He thought about Claire, who had kept a phone for 2 years because she needed proof of the best choice she had made under pressure. He thought about himself, 25, in a stairwell, and 31 at a kitchen table, and now at a window with coffee that was still too hot to drink. He thought, revenge never gives back what was lost. He thought, but sometimes, when you stop staying quiet about the things that mattered, when you stop letting the weight distribute silently and wrong, you remember, in a very specific way, that you are still the kind of person who acts, that you are still, after everything, alive in that sense. He drank the coffee. The city was out there, doing its work. So was he. This has been a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.